to BIM's Dives. I'm Dr. Tierra Moore, founder and CEO of Black in Marine Science. And today we're diving into ocean justice with Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. The conversation will be moderated by our Chief Operating Officer, Leslie Townsell, who is a master's student, and our Chief Innovation Officer, Dr. Jeanette Davis, who is a marine microbiologist and children's book author. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is a marine biologist, policy expert, writer, and Brooklyn native. She is founder of Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank for coastal cities, and is co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet. With Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, she co-edited the anthology, All We Can Save, and co-founded the All We Can Save project to nurture the feminist climate renaissance. So recently, Ayana co-created the Blue New Deal, a roadmap for including the ocean in climate policy. And we are so excited to talk more with her about that today. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Leslie. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here with us today.
Our pleasure.
Earlier today, we actually asked our audience members over social media what ocean justice means to them. So at the end of our chat, we will go over a couple of the answers. But for now, can you define ocean justice and tell us what are some actions that can be taken in regards to it?
First, I want to say I'm stoked to be here with you two. I'm so glad that Black in Marine Science is a thing that exists. So thank you and congratulations. And I didn't realize how important visibility was until I became more visible and started hearing stories from people who told me that it made them feel like, oh, well, maybe I can do this. I was never totally sure how much this, like, you can't be what you can't see thing actually mattered until recently, because I just never saw it. So I just never expected it to be there. And I'm stubborn, so I just did it anyway. And I just always expected to be alone in the field as a Black woman, unless I was working in the Caribbean, let's say. So I'm just really proud of what you all are putting together. So gotta start there. This is dope. I'm digging the drip. You guys got the shirts, like it's all happening. So for me, ocean justice is the intersection between ocean conservation and social justice. Because when we think about social justice, I would say is like the biggest circle, right? About like how we think about equal rights, equal opportunity, like eliminating barriers and persecution and violence that's based on these demographics. And often we think about it as primarily race, but lots of other sort of areas of that as well, of course. And then sort of in my world, within that, there's like environmental justice, and then there's climate justice, and then there's ocean justice, which often gets left out of both environment and climate, let alone social justice. So for me, it's a term that reminds people that the ocean is a part of our climate system, our environment, and that we need to think about the people who whose jobs depend on the ocean, whose economies, whose cultures depend on the ocean when we think about ocean conservation and climate policy. Because if we don't deliberately include people at this point, they get left out. So the first decade of my career, when I was in graduate school, and then for 4 or 5 years after, I was working in the Caribbean, in Curacao and Bonaire and Montserrat and Antigua and Barbuda. And so for me, it was always really clear, the link, because you're living in the legacy of colonialism in Caribbean islands. You're seeing who has access to what ocean resources, who has access to which ocean careers, who who the laws and policies are built to benefit. The fact that there's often more of an interest in taking care of wealthy tourism operators than local fishermen, right? Who's dealing with where are the sewage outflows? Where is the pollution being cleaned up and not, right? Like it is just like so many issues in our society, the burden is borne disproportionately by communities of color and by low-income communities. So for me, ocean justice is just a subset of the mashup of social and environmental justice topics. And it's basically one of the many ways I feel like my job is to raise my hand for the ocean in so many conversations. And this is another one of those. Yeah, I probably should have like a 5-word definition, but instead you get like a 5-minute ramble. Sorry, it's Friday night.
That was a great answer.
No, that was a great answer. And, I think you did a great job of kind of tying in that climate change piece, because when we think about climate, oftentimes people just think about the atmosphere, but it is the ocean that works together with the atmosphere. And when you think about Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, Maria, you can go on. We see that oftentimes underserved communities are the most impacted demographic when it comes to climate change and social justice. Mm-hmm. So how can we better protect those communities specifically that are most vulnerable? That's one question. And then to further that, what are some of kind of like the immediate things you think could happen versus the longer term things to really get at protecting those most vulnerable communities?
So this is a really hard and really large question, and it's a really important one. And it reminds me of the years that I spent working in Barbuda, this incredible island in the northeast corner of the Caribbean, part of Antigua and Barbuda. And the community has relied on the ocean for their food, for their jobs, for their culture for centuries. And it used to be a single plantation, the whole island. It's also the only really solid example that I've seen of reparations. When slavery ended, the entire island was given to the former slaves who lived there, and they owned the entire island in common. Until the story I'm about to tell you, which is I ended up working there and supporting the fishing community, the local government, in trying to figure out what would it look like to sustainably manage those ocean resources. And because this is Black and marine science, I sort of came in through this science perspective of what do we need to know about the coral reef ecosystem and the mangroves and the seagrass and the lagoon and just the coastal habitat that the local government had jurisdiction over. And so we brought in a whole team of experts to do ecological surveys and assessments and like species identifications and counts and understanding the diversity and sorry about the sirens, and where are the nursery habitats, and just mapping the different types of ecosystems that were even there so that they could know what they had and then decide how they wanted to manage that. And so we did all that research, provided that information, and the goal was to come up with this plan for ocean zoning for what areas would be protected, what areas would be for recreation, for anchoring areas, for shipping lanes, for certain kinds of fishing. And the community drew the lines on the map. And based on the scientific recommendations, as well as the data we collected, they decided to protect 1/3 of each type of ecosystem, and 1/3 of their waters overall, and protect especially herbivores that, as I'm sure you know, are really important in coral reef ecosystems for preventing algae from overgrowing the coral, protecting sharks, only for traditional local consumption, no sale or commercial use or export. So this completely visionary and robust set of ocean policies that, after about a year of public consultation and many, many iterations, was signed into law. Protecting mangroves and seagrasses as well, you would need a permit to destroy them. I was really proud of helping to facilitate that work and drive it forward when I was executive director of the Waite Institute, and building the team of like scientists and lawyers and GIS experts and filmmaker and everyone to support the community in figuring out, like, this is their ocean. What did they want to do with it? And this was put into place, and we helped with enforcement, I had to figure out like how to buy a boat for patrols, and like how are we going to design the uniforms, and like down to the, like, I was interrupting dominoes games to get fishermen's input into like draft zoning maps, like the whole nine. And then about a year after it was signed into law, Hurricane Irma hit. And the eye of the storm went right over the island and just decimated the place in a way that it has yet to recover from. And you think about what it means for a Black community in the Caribbean to try so hard to do everything right, to say like, you weird American outsider, like, I guess we'll give this a shot. Like we care about the future of our marine ecosystems, and to take that leap of faith and to put in a year of work to do that, and this to see everything just flattened, and the impacts on marine life, obviously, as well as the buildings and infrastructure on the island. And thankfully, very few people were hurt. So once I got past that, my immediate thought was like, this island is basically at sea level, it's flat. And no matter what they do, no matter how perfect their ocean conservation laws are, no matter how perfectly based on the best science they are, it will never be enough, because we live in a world that is connected. And it is not their fault that the ocean was so warm, that the storm was so strong, and that it moved so slowly. That is the fault of fossil fuel companies and all the politicians in their pockets. And that, to me, is one of the most heartbreaking examples of the injustice that comes along with climate change for coastal communities. And in the wake of that, what happened was a land grab. This community who had collectively owned the land on the whole island. No one had like a deed, because they all owned it together. And if you were a resident of the island, you got a place to build a house, and you got a place to grow food, and you got a place to set up a shop. And in the wake of this, the government of Antigua, with pressure from developers, changed the land policies, broke up this most beautiful example of reparations, and started a land grab. And of all people, Robert De Niro is trying to build a Nobu resort called Paradise Found, which is like the most offensive sort of like Columbusing vibe you can imagine, and been trying to push it through for years. And the community was like, no, we don't want this here unless you're going to like have a small footprint, be really environmentally friendly, and employ local people. And they wouldn't agree to those terms. So they didn't want it. And then you had like the founder of Patron Tequila and Paul Mitchell Hair Products, another sort of like billionaire developer, coming in and wanting to build a resort there and pushing the Antigua government to change the rules so that they can override the will of the people. And exploit their most pristine beaches and not employ anyone, and dredge for yacht harbors and create airport strips that the local people can't use because it's a private airport, and like all of this shit. And to me, this is like the ultimate example of how it can go wrong. how you have like local communities who have a deep knowledge for generations of what sustainability means, who need support as the world is changing around them, to like adapt to this changing world. And I guess the answer to your question then of what do we do is we stand with these people, right? We take a side. We focus on policy and changing the rules of the game. We make sure that the science that we do and that exists gets used to inform good decision making. We, use the power of our voices, our networks, our influence, our dollars to say like, there actually is a right and a wrong. And I'm on the right side. And I'm with the local people. And I think we sometimes forget how powerful our collective voices are, especially in the US, because it's just so individualistic. And we also forget how important the ocean is culturally. We sort of break it down into like resources and like how many fish can we take and what is the maximum sustainable yield that the ocean can handle. And I think part of the solution is a really hard and amorphous thing, which is like, how do we instigate a cultural shift, a transformation in the way that we see our role as one species out of many millions of species on this planet, and have like a little fucking humility about the whole thing. So unfortunately, there are no easy answers in situations like this where the power imbalance is so out of whack, right? Where you have American billionaires and subsistence local fishermen. Like, it's just not a fair fight. And this is playing out in coastal communities all over the world. And so in a weird way, like the battles are in like the zoning board meetings for who even has access to the coastline, right? It's like the boring local politics of it. But there absolutely is a role for science in doing really solid, objective, just polished research to provide information so that better decisions could be made to protect those communities in the future. So I think because, this is a science crew, I just want to emphasize that your science can be perfectly objective as far as hypothesis and collection of data and testing it and your statistics and all of that, and going through the peer review process, but you get to choose your research questions. And people like me, and probably you, because of who we are, ask different questions. That doesn't make our science biased. It makes us ask different and often more relevant and useful questions. And so I think, I'm like tingling saying all of this because I'm reminding myself of how high the stakes are when it comes to, ocean science and policy. So thank you for that question.
So you just brought up a really good point, talking about like how the three of us might ask more relevant questions. So now I want to bring it over to the side of women. What is the significance of having women centered in the talk about ocean justice? I also see you have your climate feminist sweater on. So, that's what kind of prompted it.
Before I answer that question, which I'm happy to answer, I want to hear from you. What kind of science are you each doing? What questions have you been inspired to ask?
So right now, I am currently studying the impacts of climate change on oyster aquaculture along the Georgia coast. So I'm doing a lot of chemical oceanography, looking at alkalinity, salinity, temperature, pH, just those kind of metrics. And it's really important for me because those communities along the Georgia coast are predominantly Black communities, and the oyster oyster aquaculture used to be huge in Georgia in the early 20th century, and now it's kind of fallen by the wayside. So for me, the importance of that is bringing back that oyster fishery for these oyster fishers who are predominantly Black in these predominantly Black communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say for me, so currently, I am kind of at this intersection of ocean science and policy. I work in a federal agency. Prior to that, a lot of my research focused on marine microbiology. And I was essentially looking at marine microbes and their ability to produce interesting compounds that we can use for medicine. So I've always been interested in this intersection between ocean, respecting the ocean, and how by doing things sustainably, we can access the resources from the ocean. And one example that I would give when I was doing my research, I went to the University of Maryland, but all of my field work was in Hawaii, which was amazing. And I was studying this anti-cancer compound that had been discovered in a Hawaiian sea slug in the early 1990s. And, you know, when there's something interesting in the water, then, you know, big pharmaceuticals gets a hold of it, and they want to go and just basically collect as much as possible without really understanding, one, the actual ecosystem in the environment, but the people who depend on that ecosystem. So at one point, there was so much collecting of this particular species that it was on the decline. And as a marine microbiologist, my job was to say, hey, how can I better understand the bacteria that are associated with this organism in hopes of finding the true anti-cancer producer as opposed to the animal itself. And I remember going out to the community and doing some collection, but one thing that I did was get to know the members of that particular community. I remember having conversations with the local people. There was this one particular family that lived across the way from where I was doing my collection. And I just had a conversation with them, showed them like my permits, what I was ultimately trying to do. And it really cultivated a good collaboration, because for them, it's like, we live on this beautiful island of Hawaii. And while people come here for tourism and trying to find drug discovery, this is our home. So why are you here? And, you know, how is what you're going to do impact the local community? So I think it's important, no matter what science you're pursuing, whether you're in the government, whether you're in lab, or wherever you are, that you are always representing the people who are impacted by the decisions that you make.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad I asked. It's such a treat to hear about your research. And I think as much as I've always been driven by doing scientific studies that are directly useful for policymaking decisions, whether that's like types of fishing gear and how to reduce bycatch, or, you know, social science around, you know, behavioral economics of fishing communities, again, to like help shape policy. I think that we get to just enjoy nudibranchs too, right? Like, we don't have to save the world every day. We can like have the same sort of fascination with how incredible the ocean is, and be part of the research community that's trying to understand just like, how does it all work? Because I think as much as I'm one of these weirdos who got a PhD in marine biology specifically to go do policy and never then do another scientific study again, which is like a very unusual career plan. I wanted to understand the science really deeply so that I could interpret it for policy, and build that bridge from the science side, because a lot of people will build that bridge from the law side to policy, obviously. But just because that was my plan doesn't mean like every person of color has a duty to save other people of color who live near the coast. Like, you can just be a scientist. And I think the reason that I asked you about your research is so often when we talk about Black scientists, we talk about their Blackness and not their science. And I think we miss out on like the most interesting conversations, right? Because like Black History Month is all about, this is Ayana, she's a Black scientist. No one talks about my research. Like no one ever links to my peer-reviewed publications. When we talk about George Washington Carver, we talk about him as like a Black guy in the peanut. We don't talk about like his scientific research and his discoveries in detail. And so when people ask me like, how do we like, as educators, like we want to bring more role models into the classroom? I'm like, great, don't teach their biographies, teach their discoveries. Mm-hmm. And I think that's my frustration with a lot of the way that I've watched Black History Month play out in the past few years. It's like 5 Black people to follow. It's like, but really why? Like, tell me about their achievements, because they're so fascinating, right? Like, if you're going to highlight scientists, like highlight the science. It's so cool. Like both of you are doing, have done, will do really interesting and important work. And I think so often, because of the rest of the world waking up to social injustice, they forget about the expertise that is carried in a body that has melanin.
There you go.
Okay, so thank you for sharing some about your research. And I actually meant to put on these gold hoops before we started, and then I forgot because I was running late, and yours looks so dope that here we go.
Thank you.
So gender, and what was your question? Like, why does that piece matter too?
So I was just asking, what's the significance of having women centered in the talk about ocean justice?
It's hard to have this conversation without devolving into stereotypes. I can read to you a little passage from All We Can Save. As was introduced, I co-edited this anthology this year, and it's really good, which I get to objectively say because it's a collection of wisdom. This is not me writing a book. This is me helping to pull together a lot of brilliant women leading on climate from all different perspectives, with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, my co-editor. And in the beginning of the book, we summarize some of the social science that is the evidence for why gender equality matters in climate more generally. So if it's okay, I'll just read a few sentences of that. More than a problem of bias, suppressing the climate leadership and participation of women and girls, half the world's brain power and change-making might sets us up for failure. Research shows that women have an edge over men when it comes to the planet. Caring about the environment and climate change and acting on that care, aversion to taking on outside risk or imposing it on others, something data indicates white men are particularly inclined to do. I'm just going to pause there because this is a very important point. That like quantitatively white men take more risks that affect other people because of a history of things having worked out for them in the past. Mm-hmm. And that's fine when you're like playing jackass games with your friends and you're just going to hurt yourself. But it's not fine when it's climate change or the future of the ocean. And this assumption that like things work out because they've always worked out for me is very dangerous when you're making decisions on behalf of humanity and the rest of the planet. Yeah. This edge carries into politics and policymaking. Female legislators more strongly support environmental laws and stricter laws at that. When parliaments have greater representation of women, they are more likely to ratify environmental treaties. When women participate equally with men, climate policy interventions are more effective. At a national level, higher political and social status for women correlates with lower carbon emissions and greater creation of protected land areas. It's not about only women, but making sure women are included and leading at all levels. And I sort of knew it was important, sort of like intuitively, for women to be in leadership positions. But I didn't know the data was that strong, right? Like it is quantitatively, statistically better for the planet for women to have decision-making power. And I don't know if there are equivalent studies that are specific to the ocean, but I do know that if we just look at who's in this chat and who steps up to lead and who steps up to organize and who volunteers their time to put things together and who cares about nurturing the community, and who is focused on, you know, future generations. When I was working in the Caribbean, you have this sort of unfortunate dichotomy where gender stereotypes or gender roles mean that the men who are fishing are trying to be the breadwinners, are trying to put food on the table today. And women are often having this long-term view about, like, what about my grandchildren, our grandchildren? And so you need both, right? You need to feed your family today and you need to feed your grandchildren tomorrow. We need to make sure there's something left for them. So if we leave women out of decision-making, women who, like, there is social science that tend to think longer term in terms of the cost benefit analysis of decision-making, then we're just like leaving a lot of intellectual power and creativity on the table. So I think anyone of any gender can be a climate feminist, and sort of approach problem solving through the lens of gender equality being a prerequisite for success. And I think when we talk about both race and gender, we often think about it as like the nice thing to do, to care about diversity and to like include other people and have like great photo ops where it just like looks like a Benetton ad. But what we don't talk about enough is like, that's literally the way we win. Like, that's where we get the best ideas. That's where we will succeed in dealing with the climate crisis. Like, because we know people of color care more about climate change in America. It is 49% of white people who are concerned, 57% of Black people, and 69% of Latinx people who are like, oh shit, what are we gonna do? And people of color tend to have like a more, and that the reason for that disparity is people of color tend to have a more egalitarian worldview. This is according to polling from Yale and George Mason universities. And having this more egalitarian worldview, like we're all in this together, like we're all impacted, and what is the role I can play in the solutions, and how are we taking care of our communities? Like, that's the vibe we need. And so it's just stupid not to welcome in the people who already care if we're trying to like build the biggest, strongest team to solve the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced, right? So I guess I just get really tired of talking about race and gender as like, oh, the poor people who are getting impacted the most by climate change, and sort of this like condescending patriarchal vibe, as opposed to, and it is true that those groups are being more impacted. It is like verifiably true, and we absolutely need to take care of the injustices that result. But on the flip side, like, you're talking about women and people of color who are also leaders who are going unrecognized, underfunded, under-resourced, not listened to. So we're missing so much opportunity if we don't have diversity. And I think it's important to say, when I use the word diversity, I mean it like along all these different axes, right? Like race, gender, class, religion, geography, areas of expertise, ways of approaching problem solving. Because often people say diversity just because they're too shy to say race, but like they really mean we need some brown people in here. So just like, let's just be honest with our language, and like welcome people in, because there's more work than I can do and you can do and we can all do together. But like, we need to bring more and more and more people in. So that's kind of where my head is at these days. And so the book, All We Can Save, at the same time as we came up for the idea for the book, we came up with the idea of a nonprofit to support women climate leaders, especially women who are doing critical work, to make sure that they have the support that they need to do what they know needs to be done. I'm not going to tell them what to do, but I think so many people doing the most important organizing work across any justice issue, environmental or social, are kind of forced to do it as a side hustle. Yeah. And like, we can't save the planet as a side hustle. Like, it's, the stakes are too high. And so figuring out how to make sure that people who are doing the creative leading edge work have the funding and support, community around them, resources that they need, the microphones, the megaphones, the platforms, all of it is one of the things I'm focusing on next with the All We Can Save project, this nonprofit that Catherine and I co-created. And then my other project is the Urban Ocean Lab, a nonprofit that I co-founded about the future of coastal cities, because we know about a third of Americans live in coastal cities, and we're just not prepared for what's coming in terms of climate change. And there's so much that we can do to prevent harm, to restore coastal ecosystems that are like literally out there trying to protect us and absorb carbon and, you know, mitigate the impacts of storms, and to think about offshore renewable energy and regenerative ocean farming, including of oysters and other shellfish and seaweeds. And so I think, and of course, like, it's often poor communities and communities of color who are living in the flood zones and who don't, it's not their beach house, it's their only house, right? So I think those are sort of the two main projects that I work on besides the podcast. So one is like the urban ocean conservation, because we think about ocean conservation as like something far away and like often tropical, but it's like, it's in Brooklyn, right? It's in LA. It's in Georgia. It's everywhere. So, and then making sure women get to be a part of the decision making. And so the work I was reading the other day, the sort of organizing principles of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi. And I was super inspired by like the brevity and the clarity of, number one, lead with love. Number two, less ego, more impact. And number three, move at the speed of trust. And I was just like, that's it. That's it for all of it. As you described, Jeanette, with like talking to local communities about your research, that is the move at the speed of trust piece. We want to skip that, but like, we can't. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. And that's how it's all connecting in my head at the moment.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the question, because you are right in that, you know, we do tend to sometimes lead with the gender or the race, but we are scientists and we do science and we do great work and we can contribute because we are scientists and we are experts. So I really do appreciate that question. And just to kind of bring it back home, you know, what I heard you say is that we kind of all play a role in this, right? We all have the ability to lead where we are. And I wanted to kind of wrap that into policy and with this current administration. So from day one, with this current administration, they came in kind of signing executive orders. And one recent executive order on racial equity, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but it calls out that as in federal government that we should be employing services and products in an equitable way, right? And so I was just wondering how you see this current administration playing into policy overall with the environment, from everything with the racial executive order, as well as just rejoining the Paris Agreement. So what do you think, or what role do you think this administration will play overall with decision making when it comes to the environment?
I don't know yet. I have been pleasantly surprised by the level of ambition in the rhetoric, right? Like, I did not think they would be going this big. When it comes to climate, the commitment of dedicating 40% of the resources to address the climate crisis going to historically disadvantaged communities. I did not see that coming. When I read that in Joe Biden's campaign plan, I was like, who wrote this for him? Because his climate plan early in the primary was like not remarkable. It was not visionary. It was not bold. And he actually like stepped it up after he became the nominee and released like a much bolder plan. And I learned just this week that the reason that 40%, and that's like a percentage dedication, that's a very strong commitment. It's not like we're going to dedicate like some amount of this to blah, blah, blah. And like, it's like a percent. It's not vague. And of course, like it remains to be seen how that actually looks and how do you count it and who is deciding what the investments are in these communities, and the local officials and community leaders get input in this. Like there's a million ways it could go wrong and not be as wonderful as it could. But I learned this week that there was something called the Climate Justice Forum that got together climate justice leaders and environmental group leaders. And basically like the big white environmental groups had to listen to the climate justice leaders. And over the course of a year or two, they came up with their policy priorities, and that 40% was one of the things on their list. So these don't come out of nowhere, and it really matters who's in the room setting those priorities. And so it's, people outside the federal government who are going to have to keep pushing and keep raising the bar and like holding them accountable for the commitments that they made on the campaign trail and even in the executive orders, because there's so much like mushy gray area about like what it actually means to follow through on all of this. There's also the commitment to protect 30% of nature by 2030, but like, how are you going to count that? And like, who's going to decide which ocean areas those are, and all of that kind of stuff. So I will say that Gina McCarthy, who is leading domestic climate policy in the White House, seems to have been doing some studying on climate justice, doing her homework and trying to really like lead in that direction, taking it seriously. Her chief of staff, Maggie Thomas, is the woman I co-authored Elizabeth Warren's Blue New Deal plan with, advised the creation of that. And so I know and she also worked on their environmental justice plan. So I know we've got people in the White House who want to do the right thing, whether or not within the massive federal bureaucracy they can get it all done, or whether they'll have all of the right advisors on the nitty-gritty of how things should actually be framed and worded. I don't know yet, but I just feel like, there's an opportunity now that there wasn't 2 months ago, right? There's possibility.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to let that feel good. Like I'm going to still fight like hell to keep the bar high. But I think we now have people who at least theoretically want to get this right, which means that hopefully they will listen and continue to take input from experts on the outside. So whoever is watching this, please keep speaking up, because it's the fact that especially young people over the last year kept saying, Green New Deal, you're ruining our future and the future of life on this planet. Like, who do you think you are? You don't get to do that, which is the reason that we had Democratic candidates fighting for who had the best climate policy, which is why Joe Biden has a good climate policy, right? So it really does matter that we shift the status quo within culture, so that what we all expect from our political leaders is a lot more than they have been doing so far.
So I know that we only have 10 minutes left. So we had some audience questions, and we just picked one of them to ask. So you've been very effective at getting climate message to a huge audience. How did you do so effectively, like getting that message out and collaborating with Elizabeth Warren and Gimlet?
The short answer is trial and error. like, I don't know the future and I don't know what I'm doing. And I like never thought I would be co-creating and co-hosting a climate podcast. That like was not on my list of things to do. In fact, about 2 years ago, I don't know if you listened to the podcast, It's Been a Minute, hosted by Sam Sanders, who is dope. And yeah, he's like, this very cool Black guy about my age who works at NPR, who hosted the Politics podcast, and now he has his own show. And I like knew him from when we both lived in DC. And I was like, I want to start a podcast. Can you give me your advice? And he was like, totally, let's chat. Let me hear your idea. And I was like, it's called Ocean Nerds. And he was like, what? I was like, it's an interview show and I interview ocean nerds, but like all kinds of nerds, like submarine pilots and like tuna spearfishing divers and like tunicate experts and like all of it. Like, isn't it amazing? Like, what's in the Mariana Trench? And he was like, I was like, and we go super deep in the weeds and we like define our terms so everyone can follow along, but like, it's extremely specific on like boat captains and like sailing and like whatever. I was like all in. And I was basically like told a lot of people this idea and they're like, I'm sure this will be delightful for a very small group of people. So if I had it my way, that would be the podcast I would have launched like 3 years ago. And I think for me with the Blue New Deal, it all just starts with like seeing a need, right? So I will quickly tell you the story of how both of those things came to be, since those are the two specific examples. With the Blue New Deal, I read the Green New Deal. I got to page 10 and saw the first mention of the ocean, and it was like a list of things we should protect, sort of like in passing, includes the ocean. And I was like, really, this is all we get? This is not enough. The ocean in the same sense as we were discussing before, like the ocean is not just a victim of climate change. It's also the hero. It's absorbed 1/3 of the carbon dioxide. It's absorbed 90% of the heat we've trapped with greenhouse gases. It is like literally out here trying to save us and like offering us all these opportunities for renewable energy and regenerative ocean farming and like coastal ecosystems, like being the barrier for storms and all this stuff. And I was just like, we're missing it. We're missing these opportunities. And obviously I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Every ocean person who read it thought that. And for people who haven't read the Green New Deal resolution, go read it. It'll take you 5 minutes. It's literally 14 pages, double spaced, massive font. Go read it. And then you can tell me if you hate it, but like, go read it first. And so I was talking with a bunch of other ocean people about this, and they were like, yeah, where's the ocean? And so we wrote an op-ed. I co-authored it with a fisherman, ocean farmer, and a head of an environmental group, Surfrider. And we put our heads together and like, this is what it would look like to include the ocean in the Green New Deal. And it was called A Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. We published that, and that got the attention of a think tank, Data for Progress. And then we collaborated with them on a policy memo about especially the opportunity for blue jobs, like ocean economy, and published that. And there was some polling about people actually like supported doing more on oceans. And then Bren Smith, one of my co-authors for both of those things, recorded a video question to ask in the CNN climate town hall. And it just happened that Elizabeth Warren was the person who got the question. And he was like, Green New Deal, yeah, but like, what about those of us who make our living on the ocean? Would you consider a Blue New Deal? And she was like, that sounds like a great idea. I'm in. And then her staff was like, our boss just committed to a Blue New Deal on national television. Oh, shit. And so then they called me and they're like, can you help us make this thing? Like, we have to do this now. And then like a month or so later, we rolled out this plan. And so like, it wasn't a premeditated thing. It was just like, you speak up when you see a gap or a problem, you do the thing that you can do. In my case, it was like writing op-eds and nerdy policy things and like posting them on social media. And Bren asked his question, and then I was called in to help, and then sort of like one thing led to another. And the Biden team has adopted some of those policy proposals into the work that they're doing. And so it's not a story of like a grand plan. It's like a story of seeing where you can be helpful, and just stepping in. And of course, all of this work is unpaid on the side work. So that's not ideal, I guess, but that's the way so much of this important work happens. And then with Gimlet and Spotify and the podcast, I met my co-host at a dinner party, and Alex Bloomberg had sold the company to Spotify. He was thinking about what he wanted to do next. And I was like, what's your plan? He was like, I'm going to co-host a podcast about climate. I really think that that's the most important issue. And I was like, are you going to have a co-host, like maybe a scientist who could like explain those parts? Maybe like a woman, maybe a person of color, to bring another perspective to the interviews and stuff like this. And he was like, yeah, of course. Like, absolutely. That sounds right. And I was like, oh, what if it was me? And he was like, who are you? And then like a few meetings later, we were like brainstorming what was the show. And it took us 9 months to craft it. And I think the reason that it's been so well received, as along with the book, All We Can Save, and the Blue New Deal, is because it's all focused on solutions. It's not focused on categorizing how everything is falling apart. We use that science to tell stories and to make the case for what needs to be done. But it's all like, all right, this is where we're at. What is next? Who should we be listening to? Who should we be following? What policy ideas are the most promising? What entrepreneurial ideas are the most promising? What's the activism that needs doing? Like, to the extent that I've gained traction for the work that I do, it's been because people want to know, like, okay, fine, like, it's terrifying. What do we do about it? And so I think that's been the lesson for me in the past year, is that this is not about like converting climate deniers. This is about working with the vast majority of Americans who get it and are not quite sure what that means for their lives and what that means for politics and policy and culture and their jobs and their families. And it's also like much more fun to focus on the what do we do part, right? Like there's so much room for creativity and joy and art and music, and we get to like shape the future, right? There's still a wide range of possible futures. And that's what I do every day. I wake up and I'm like, how can I like play whatever role I can play in helping to nudge us towards the best possible one?
Well, thank you so much for that answer. It's now a few minutes until 7, so we're going to wrap up here. We want to thank you so much for coming. We really not only appreciate you being our first guest on BIM's Dive, but we actually appreciate all that you do. We appreciate your transparency and your willingness to serve. So thank you. At the beginning, Leslie did talk about how we polled some of our BIM's community what ocean justice means to them. And you have done a great job of not only defining that, but also looking at some next steps. So what we wanted to do to wrap up is just to quickly select a few definitions from our viewers. So one person defines ocean justice as giving the ocean the same chance to survive and thrive as I give myself. Another says, defined broadly, ocean justice is inland communities and also coastal communities, the freedom of both of those communities. And then lastly, I really like this one. I want to highlight this. It says, to me, ocean justice is when the protection of all that is righteous becomes as expansive and as fluid and flowing as the ocean herself. That maybe one day we won't even need to call it ocean justice anymore, because we'll look out from the land connected to the ocean and know that justice needs no magnification.
I really like that one.
wanted to end with that one. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your transparency. Thank you for your journey. And thank you for being a great example.
Thanks for all that you're doing, both of you. All three of you.
Thank y'all so much for tuning in to our first BIMS Dives. Make sure you follow, like, and subscribe, and then check all of us out here, and make sure you join us in our fight for racial and ocean justice, because the time is now. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.